Up to 10 inches of rain are falling on the North Carolina coast, and parts of the Outer Banks are already underwater. Forecasters put a corridor from Raleigh to Virginia Beach under one of the highest flood risks they issue, and it is verifying right now. But the flooding is only the opening move of something much larger. The same stalled weather pattern drowning the East Coast today is about to trap dangerous heat over the plains and unleash 3 straight days of severe storms on the same regions. Here's how one stuck pattern does all of it. Right now, as this goes out, a slow-motion flooding disaster is unfolding across the Carolinas and Virginia, and the rain has not stopped. It started yesterday morning, it fell through the night, and it is still coming down across parts of eastern North Carolina this morning. The Weather Prediction Center went into yesterday with a moderate risk of excessive rainfall stretching from Raleigh all the way to Virginia Beach, and that is not a routine call. A moderate risk means forecasters expected the kind of rainfall that produces widespread, dangerous flooding, and that is exactly what has been playing out on the ground. Here's the part that matters most, and it is the reason this story is bigger than one bad day of weather. What is hitting the East Coast right now is not a single storm that blows through and clears out. It is the leading edge of a weather pattern that has locked into place over the entire country, and that pattern is about to do something unusual over the next week. Today, it is drowning the Carolinas. In a few days, it is going to bake the middle of the country under a dome of heat and set off round after round of severe storms in the same regions, over and over again. So before we get to what is coming, you need to understand what is happening at this hour, because people are being told to get off the roads and get to higher ground while we speak. The rain fell in a narrow, punishing band, and it fell on the same towns for hours. That is the difference between a normal summer downpour and a flash flood emergency, and it is the first sign of just how stuck this pattern really is. And it helps to be clear about what a moderate risk of excessive rainfall actually means, because forecasters do not hand that label out casually. The Weather Prediction Center runs a scale, and moderate is the second highest tier of flooding risk they issue. It is reserved for days when they expect numerous flash floods, the kind that overwhelm creeks and storm drains and turn low spots into standing water fast enough that people get trapped. When you see that level go up over a corridor as long as Raleigh to Virginia Beach, the forecasters are telling you in advance that they expect a widespread and dangerous event, not an isolated problem. That is the call they made for yesterday, and the rain has verified it. Let's talk about the numbers, because they tell you how serious this is. The heavy rain set up along a line running roughly from Franklin, North Carolina to Kill Devil Hills, and Raleigh took a direct hit through yesterday's late morning and afternoon. Across most of North Carolina, the high-resolution forecast model was pointing to a widespread 3 to 8 inches of rain, with pockets picking up 6 to 8 inches. Winston-Salem and the areas just south of it were squarely in that zone. Out toward the coast, it gets worse. Near Cape Hatteras and the Outer Banks, some locations were forecast to pick up 8 to 10 inches of rain over about a day and a half. Virginia Beach and the area around Ahoskie were looking at 5 to 6 inches. When you drop that much water on flat, low-lying coastal ground that drains slowly, the water has nowhere to go. And that is when roads turn into rivers and neighborhoods that never flood suddenly find water rising toward their doors. To put 8 to 10 inches in perspective, that is close to what many of these communities would normally expect across 2 or 3 entire months of summer, arriving instead in a little over a day. The soil can only absorb so much so fast, and once it is saturated, every additional inch runs straight off into the streets and the drainage channels. That is the point where the flooding stops being a nuisance and starts being a threat to life, because moving water only a foot or 2 deep is enough to sweep a car off a road. Most people who die in these events die in their vehicles trying to cross water they underestimated. And this is not only an East Coast problem, which is another clue about how large this pattern is. Out in the Central Plains, a separate slug of heavy rain was setting up near Kansas City and back toward Denver. Dodge City, Kansas was forecast to pick up nearly 4 inches of rain if the model verified, with 1 to 3 inches around Salina and Emporia and 1 to 2 inches near Wichita. So we have significant flooding rain on the East Coast and significant flooding rain in the middle of the country at the same time from the same overall setup. That is not a coincidence. It is what happens when the atmosphere stops moving. To understand why this is happening, you have to look up at the jet stream, because the jet stream is the engine behind everything you are about to see this week. When the jet stream is behaving normally, it moves weather systems along at a steady pace, and a rainstorm is a few hours of rain before it slides off to the east. But right now, the jet stream has buckled into a big, high-amplitude, slow-moving wave, and the features riding inside it, the troughs and the fronts, have essentially stalled out. There is a stalled frontal boundary draped across the eastern part of the country, and that boundary is acting like a focusing line. Thunderstorms are forming along it and then moving parallel to it, which means one storm after another crosses the exact same towns in sequence. Meteorologists call this training because the storms pass over a fixed point like rail cars behind a locomotive, one after another on the same track. Training is the single most efficient way the atmosphere produces extreme rainfall because the total at any one spot is not one storm's worth of rain. It is hours of storms stacked back to back. The reason the boundary is not moving is the shape of that jet stream wave. When the jet flattens out and moves fast, fronts get shoved along and rain events are brief. But when the jet buckles into big, sharp northward and southward swings, those swings move slowly, sometimes barely at all, and everything anchored to them grinds to a halt. A front that would normally sweep through in an afternoon instead sits over the same counties for a day or more. That is what has happened here, and it is why the same radar returns keep blooming over the same towns hour after hour. There's also a large dip in the jet stream sitting over the Midwest and the Northeast right now, and that is the same feature that produced a severe weather outbreak and serious flooding across North Carolina and Virginia in the days just before this. In other words, this is not the pattern's first strike on this region. It has already been working this ground, which is part of why the soil was primed to flood so quickly when the heaviest rain arrived. That is why Raleigh and the North Carolina coast are seeing the numbers they are seeing. It is not that any individual storm is historic. It is that the pattern is holding them in place and feeding them, refusing to let them move on. And once you understand that mechanism, that the danger comes from the pattern locking storms over the same ground, you understand the entire rest of this forecast. Because that same stuck pattern is going to keep doing it in different parts of the country for days. Now here is where the story takes a turn that surprises most people because the water flooding North Carolina came from a storm that made landfall near Texas. That storm is Tropical Storm Bertha, and it is one of the strangest parts of this whole setup. Bertha came ashore near New Orleans on Wednesday afternoon as a weak tropical storm, with maximum sustained winds of only about 45 miles per hour. It then drifted back over the Gulf, and overnight into this morning, has been pushing toward a second landfall near Houston, Texas, as a low-end tropical storm with winds around 45 to 50 miles per hour. By any measure of wind, Bertha is a weak, disorganized system, and it is not forecast to strengthen into a hurricane. But here's the thing about a decaying tropical storm. It is carrying an enormous reservoir of tropical moisture, and that moisture does not just stay with the storm. The stalled front to the northeast has been reaching down and pulling that deep Gulf moisture hundreds of miles inland, straight into the Carolinas. So the worst flooding is happening not where the storm is, but 1,000 miles away from its center. The storm you can see spinning on the tropical map near Texas is not where the worst water is falling. Part of why Bertha never became a hurricane is the same high pressure and wind shear that has shaped this entire pattern. A ridge built over the top of the storm, and the winds around that ridge tore at Bertha's structure, stripping the thunderstorms away from its center and shoving them off to the side. That is why the storm looks so lopsided, with all of its deep convection displaced away from where it is actually spinning. But a storm being torn apart does not make the moisture disappear. It just releases it to be carried somewhere else, and in this case, the somewhere else is the flooded corridor of the Carolinas. This is one of the most counterintuitive things in meteorology. A weak, falling apart tropical storm can be more dangerous for people far inland than a stronger, tighter storm would have been, precisely because its moisture gets spread across half the country instead of staying wrapped around a center. Along the immediate coast, Bertha still carries its own hazards. Storm surge of up to 3 feet is possible from roughly Houston back toward New Orleans. There's a localized flooding risk from Corpus Christi up toward Galveston, and dangerous rip currents are running all along the shoreline. But the real fingerprint Bertha is leaving on this week is the moisture it exported northeast, the moisture that turned a stalled front into a flash flood emergency in a completely different part of the country. There is one more reason the flooding threat is so alarming, and it has to do with where some of the heaviest rain is falling. Over the Great Smoky Mountains and the Cherokee National Forest, forecast totals were running anywhere from around 2 inches on the low end to as much as 8 or 9 inches over a day and a half. Under normal circumstances, that much rain in the mountains is already a serious flash flood and landslide threat. But this ground is not under normal circumstances. This is the same western North Carolina terrain that Hurricane Helene devastated back in 2024, when catastrophic flooding tore through these mountains, wiped out roads, and reshaped entire river valleys. That kind of event does not just cause damage and then heal. It leaves behind destabilized slopes, altered drainages, and hillsides that are far more prone to failing when the next heavy rain arrives. So when you drop another 8 or 9 inches of rain on terrain that is still scarred and still fragile, you are not starting from zero. You are adding stress to ground that is already broken, and the flash flood and debris flow risk in those areas is elevated well beyond what the rainfall numbers alone would suggest. The mountains make everything worse in a way that flat land does not. Rain that falls across a wide slope does not soak in and spread out. It funnels downhill into narrow valleys and stream beds, collecting as it goes, so that a creek that was a trickle in the morning can become a wall of water by the afternoon, add in loose debris, downed trees and soil that was already loosened by the last disaster, and you get the ingredients for the fast-moving, destructive flooding that killed so many people across these same mountains before. The people who live there know exactly what this looks like, and that is why the warnings this time carry an extra weight. This is a community being asked to relive a nightmare on ground that is not finished recovering from the last one. This is why forecasters have been pleading with people in these zones to take it seriously, to turn around rather than drive through flooded roads, and to stay weather aware if they live in a low-lying area. When you combine record moisture, training storms, and terrain that has already been broken once, you get exactly the conditions that turn a flood watch into a tragedy, and all of it traces back to a single pattern that will not move. So step back for a second, because this is the idea that ties the whole week together. What is flooding the Carolinas today is not a standalone event. It is one output of a single, stuck weather pattern, and that pattern is about to produce a completely different kind of disaster in a completely different part of the country. The same jammed configuration that is holding a front over North Carolina is also building a dome of high pressure over the center of the nation, and it is setting up a corridor of severe storms that will fire again and again over the coming days. Think of it as one machine with two outputs. On one side, over the east, the pattern wrings tropical moisture out over saturated ground and floods it. On the other side, over the middle of the country, the same pattern is going to trap heat and then manufacture severe thunderstorms along its edge. Heat and flooding and damaging storms all sound like separate stories, but they are the same story, driven by the same stalled jet stream that refuses to progress. That is what makes this setup so unusual and so dangerous. It is not that any one piece of it is unprecedented. It is that a pattern this stuck keeps generating new hazards over the same regions before the previous ones have even cleared. Today, it is water on the East Coast. Over the weekend and into next week, it becomes heat and violent storms in the middle of the country. And understanding why comes down to understanding that high-pressure dome that is about to build. Heading into today and tomorrow, most of the country actually gets a brief break from the organized severe weather, but do not mistake that lull for relief, because the temperature is about to climb hard. A large area of high pressure is building across the southern tier and the plains, and that is going to send temperatures soaring into what feels like the peak of mid-July. This is the heat dome, and it is the second output of the very same pattern we have been tracking. A heat dome is a strong ridge of high pressure sitting up in the atmosphere, and underneath it, the air sinks, compresses, and warms. That sinking air suppresses clouds and rain and lets the sun cook the surface day after day, which is how you get a prolonged, dangerous heat wave building across the Great Plains. But here's the part that matters for the rest of the country, and it is the reason the heat and the storms are connected. A ridge that's strong also acts like a boulder in a stream. Disturbances riding along in the jet stream cannot punch straight through it, so they are forced to ride up and over its northern edge. That northern edge becomes a highway. Warm, unstable, moisture-loaded air at the surface meets the disturbances passing overhead, and organized severe thunderstorms fire right along the rim of the dome. So the heat dome is not just a heat story. It is the steering feature that is about to aim round after round of severe weather across the northern and eastern flanks of the country, which brings us to the most unusual part of this entire forecast. The heat itself deserves respect, because heat is quietly the deadliest form of severe weather in the country, year after year outpacing tornadoes, hurricanes, and floods for total fatalities. A dangerous heat wave building over the plains at the peak of summer is not just uncomfortable. It stresses the power grid as air conditioners run flat out. It endangers anyone without cooling or without shelter, and it becomes especially dangerous when the nights stay warm and the body never gets a chance to recover. As this ridge strengthens, that is the risk building across the middle of the country, even on the days when the sky looks calm and blue. And that calm is deceptive, because a heat dome does not make the atmosphere safe. It stores energy. Every hot, humid, sun-baked day loads the lower atmosphere with more instability, more fuel, and when a disturbance finally rounds the top of the ridge, that stored energy is exactly what it converts into violent thunderstorms. So the same feature that bakes the plains all week is also charging the battery for the storms about to erupt along its edge. Watch what the pattern does starting Sunday, because this is where the stuck machine really shows itself. On Sunday, an intensifying storm system drops into the northern plains, with its surface pressure falling to around 995 millibars by Sunday evening. That sets up a real risk of significant severe weather across the Midwest, across Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and possibly northern Illinois, with damaging winds, large hail, and a genuine tornado threat on the table. Then, on Monday, that same system shifts south and east, and the highest risk slides into the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley. With all modes of severe weather possible, that looks like the most organized severe day of the whole stretch. And then on Tuesday, the system intensifies again as it approaches New York City, threatening yet another round of severe weather from the Carolina coast up into New England, though the exact track that far out is still uncertain. Look at what that means. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, 3 days in a row, and it is hitting nearly the same corridor of the country each time: the Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, and the Northeast. This is almost a repeat of an outbreak that rolled through these very same regions just a few days ago. That is the signature of a stalled pattern. Each new disturbance rounds the top of that heat dome and follows nearly the same path as the one before it. So the same regions keep getting hit before they have had a chance to recover. It is the exact same principle that is flooding the Carolinas today, just playing out with severe storms instead of rain. And there is a cumulative danger to getting hit like that on consecutive days. The first round of storms knocks down trees and power lines and leaves crews stretched thin. The second round hits communities that are already cleaning up, already without power, already saturated. By the third day, the ground is soaked, the rivers are up, and the tolerance for any additional wind or rain is gone. A pattern that delivers 3 organized severe days to the same corridor is not 3 times as bad as one. It compounds, and that is what makes a stuck pattern so much more dangerous than a single passing storm. Here is what should have your attention going into next week. When you get past Tuesday into the middle and end of the week, the forecast confidence drops, and that uncertainty is itself the warning. A pattern this stuck does not usually break down on a convenient schedule, and the guidance suggests it may simply recharge and deliver still more severe weather to the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and the Northeast. That is the unsettling core of this whole setup. Every time this pattern reloads, it aims at ground it has already worked over, either regions it has already soaked or regions it has already battered with storms. The flooding we are seeing on the East Coast right now is the opening move. The heat and the 3-day severe corridor are the second act. And the fact that forecasters cannot yet tell you when the pattern lets go means we cannot rule out a third act after that. A stuck jet stream is a machine that keeps running until something big enough comes along to knock it loose, and right now nothing has. So here is what to actually do with all of this. If you are in the Carolinas or Virginia today, the flooding threat is not over. The rain is lighter than it was overnight, but the ground is saturated, rivers and creeks are still rising, and it does not take much additional rain to push already flooded areas over the edge. Do not drive through water on the roads, and if you are in a low-lying area, keep paying attention. If you are anywhere along the Gulf Coast, watch the surge and the rip currents as Bertha finishes its second landfall near Houston. And if you live anywhere in the Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, or the Northeast, this weekend into next week is the time to be ready. Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday are the days to watch for damaging winds, hail, and possible tornadoes, and you will want to know how you get warnings before the storms arrive, not during. We are going to be tracking this pattern closely, because the single most important question right now is not what any one storm does. It is when this stuck pattern finally breaks, and until it does, the same regions are going to keep taking the hits.